Okay, great. Well, hello and welcome to this evening's panel, Reporting Safely in Violent and Virulent Times. I'm Dr. Diana Martinelli. I'm the Dean and Widmeyer Professor in Public Relations at the Reed College of Media at West Virginia University. Our college is hosting tonight's panel along with the generous support of Ogden Newspapers through their Ogden Newspapers Seminar Series Fund. So a special welcome to our Ogden Newspapers attendees tonight. You know, given our current turbulent political and health environments, I can't think of a more important topic for our journalism students and professionals than being more mindful of ways to practice their craft more safely. Our expert panel is going to be moderated tonight by Jim Iovino, and Jim is our Ogden Newspapers visiting professor in media innovation. Jim has an extensive journalism and digital media background, having worked both in newspaper and television newsrooms, as well as being part of a team that won a Pulitzer Prize. Jim is going to kick off this evening's event and then introduce our panelists. Jim?
All right. Thank you, Diana. I appreciate it very much. And welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight from your living rooms, your offices, your dens, wherever you are on this fine evening. So I am Jim. So thank you so much for joining us here today. And thank you for our panel as well for joining us. Just a few quick notes at the beginning. So if you please make sure that your microphones are muted throughout, I really appreciate that. If you do have questions for our panel, feel free to put those in the chat as we go along, and then we will see those and hopefully we'll be able to bring up as many of those questions as possible. We'll have time at the end to answer a lot of questions, but yeah, so you can always put your questions in the chat as we go through, and we will try to answer as many as we can. Also too, Shannon Cunningham will be putting into the chat feature there information on our workshops that are happening at the end of our panel discussion here tonight. So if you didn't register for any of those and you want to, feel free to do so via the links that Shannon puts in there. So let's get to it. So I wanted to first bring up this information from the US Press Freedom Tracker. And they've been doing a great job this year of tracking incidents against journalists in the United States. And you can see here so far in 2020, there have been, at last count from a few days ago, 201 journalists have been attacked in the United States per their count. 64 have been arrested in the country. And you can see also some equipment damage and equipment searched or seized as well. And you can see as well, the numbers don't quite match up from their counts on total cases. I think they're a little bit behind on those, but you can see the number of attacks on media in 2020 has increased significantly over 2019, 2018, 2017, and same with the number of arrests of journalists as well. And then you can also see aggressions against members of the press during Black Lives Matter protests in those cases, in those dots that you can see across the country. Journalists are doing incredible work these days all across the country and facing some significantly more aggressive responses to the work that they're doing. And they're doing under trying times for many different reasons. So I wanted to show you just a few slides about concerns that journalists have, and this comes from the Committee to Protect Journalists. They've been doing a great job this year of kind of putting some of this stuff out there in the words of the journalists themselves, of what they're covering, what they're seeing, what they're going through in this time during this year. And this first one, this comes from journalists who are covering the situation in Portland, Oregon, where demonstrations were held in support of Black Lives Matter and against police brutality. And John Rudolph, a freelance photographer, his quote is, "This was civic combat, but without live fire." And he also said he's been targeted by federal agents while covering protests. He's been shot twice once with a rubber bullet and once with a plastic bullet. And then also there are additional challenges for journalists of color as they're covering things like the Black Lives Matter protests around the country. Martin Reynolds from the Maynard Institute has really become a great voice and leader in this during this year. Says that the thing that really stood out to me at this time was that the usual understanding between police and journalists. The journalists are at the protests to do their jobs. That broke down in this case. And so you compound this with the threats that journalists of color may face being in these places, it makes the situation even worse. And a truly remarkable quote here is, "We create safety guidelines for folks who are in war-torn parts of the world and who are navigating risks in those places because you're operating in a conflict zone." Well, the reality is America is in a conflict zone. And if we are to be real about that, then we need to account for the societal implications that are not just stories for Black journalists, but realities as well. Continue on, worldwide issues close to home. This comes from a Getty photographer, John Moore, who covered the Ebola epidemic in Liberia in 2014. And literally, you know that he was going to need those skills in covering something like that with his personal protective equipment in his hometown. And then, you can see another quote there about, is it the same as covering war? It's not the same, but there are similarities that people are going through here at home. And then covering COVID at the same time as they're worrying about other issues throughout the country. Yana Paskova, a freelance photojournalist, said, "We should no longer take for granted any assignment that places us in the proximity to other people, whether healthy or ill, outdoors or indoors, especially if it's in a person's home or on hospital grounds, unless those images show us something crucial or novel about our current state of things that could absolutely not be shown another way." And then a video journalist, Lauren Frone, says, "In order to do my job well right now, I kind of have to do everything wrong. Everything we're taught as visual journalists, we really can't do. We can't spend time with people and be in their lives until you just disappear into the scene and they don't notice you. We can't get close to what's happening." So it's very hard for journalists right now to do the kind of work that they've been used to doing on a daily basis. And then compound this with online harassment. This comes from a New York Times reporter, Davy Alba, on covering conspiracy theories about COVID. And she got a lot of hate for this as soon as there was that targeted harassment with people individually messaging me through email, Instagram direct messages, her website. They started to make targeted insults. And then a really important point that was made here is newsrooms and editors sometimes want it both ways, really want these really voicey, personality-driven reporters, and at the same time, they don't want any of the controversy that may come with it. And a crucial point here for young journalists, especially our students who are listening tonight, it's important to be aware that all these forces at work and protect yourself as necessary. You have to be mindful of everything you post online. And we will be getting into that throughout the evening here. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists. So we have Dr. Michelle Ferrier, who's the founder of TrollBusters. TrollBusters helps journalists fight online abuse, and she's advocated on behalf of journalists worldwide. She's a digital content architect with more than 30 years of experience in new media technologies, digital identity, and media entrepreneurship. She's executive director of the Media Innovation Collaboratory and a professor of journalism at Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University. Diane Foley is president and founder of the James Foley Foundation. The organization has developed James Foley journalist safety curricula for both graduate and undergraduate university journalism programs and conducts work to increase access to safety training, medical insurance, and security information for freelance journalists through a Culture of Safety Alliance and other journalism and press freedom partnerships, including annual safety training grants. We also have Sally Stapleton, who launched a newly formed department as global religion editor at the Associated Press in July 2019. She was managing editor at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette from 2017 to 2019. And the staff of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette received the 2019 Pulitzer Prize in Breaking News Reporting for its coverage of the Tree of Life Synagogue hate crime massacre. She was previously managing editor at The Day in New London, Connecticut, and worked in a variety of photo leadership positions for the AP, including deputy executive photo editor, overseeing all aspects of the AP's photo operations. And we have David Shribman, who was the executive editor at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette from 2003 to 2019. He currently writes a nationally syndicated column in the US and prepares a separate column on American affairs for the Globe and Mail. He's a scholar in residence at Carnegie Mellon University, and he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in 1995 for his writing on Washington and the American political scene. And then a quarter century later, led the coverage of the Tree of Life Synagogue massacre in Squirrel Hill, and was awarded another Pulitzer Prize for his efforts there with the staff of the Post-Gazette. So with that, I'd like to stop sharing my screen so we can all see each other here. So thank you all for joining us here tonight. That was a lot of stuff I kind of went through, but I think I'd like to start with that last slide that I had up there about the online harassment and virtual safety. And I'd like to start with Dr. Ferrier on this. So with your work at TrollBusters and elsewhere, what kind of things are you hearing from journalists right now that they're very concerned about? And what are some of the ways that you're trying to help them deal with this online?
Sure. So Jim, just a little bit of background. I'm a former journalist and columnist at a newspaper almost 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, and I received hate mail as the first African-American columnist at that newspaper. So I say that to say, one, the activity that we're seeing now isn't new. But it is manifesting differently from the physical hate mail that we used to receive to the online spaces where we find a variety of tactics being used to be able to silence the voices of journalists and the stories that they might be telling. The research that we've done at TrollBusters has been global, looking at journalists doing their work around the globe and looking at the impact of specifically online and physical harassment. And that survey results from 2018 are still very relevant. Many of the journalists around the world, and particularly here in the US, see an increase in the type of online violence. This includes not only the visible kinds of things that we can see on Twitter, so the dog whistles, the memes and other types of things that are circulating online that I'll share in the second half in our workshop. But we also see them coordinating their activity and weaponizing it against some of the most very vulnerable in our profession. And so while we see, especially now in the US leading up to the election on November 3rd, an increase in attacks on journalists who are dealing with issues of politics, immigration, race, and ethnicity, and any issues of kind of the culture of our country and moving forward. We really are in a war of words online, and misinformation and disinformation has been a big part of that. But part of that strategy, misinformation and disinformation, is one part of the strategy. The other part of the strategy is to silence the voices of journalists, thought leaders, politicians, and others who have a platform and a voice, to make sure that these stories do not come out and that we sow confusion and fear and distrust among people and populations. So we have seen attacks on student journalists who are doing their work. Another vulnerable population are those early career journalists who don't have a body of work, a history of work that people can Google their name and it comes up. They're at the beginning of their careers, and these attacks are designed to thwart you from that career and divert you into public relations or some other less public facing kind of role. And so, Jim, unfortunately, this kind of surveillance, this kind of coordinated attack is different from, I think, what many people would think of as one-off attacks online, a single tweet or something like that. We are seeing consistent, persistent, coordinated activity, whether it's from far-right groups, white supremacist groups, or even foreign actors like the Ukraine or Russia. We find meddling in our national narrative about race and racial issues, and concerted efforts by folks to muddy those narratives and create dissension and protest and anger, and the very thing that we're seeing right now manifesting in our country on our streets with the protests against Black Lives Matter. It's a significant problem because the way we are trained as journalists makes us the perfect targets for trolls, because we are going to try and seek the truth of who's coming after us. And oftentimes, these attacks, even though they may not manifest in the very violent and virulent attacks at the highest ends of the register, even the insults, the critiques, the ways in which the credibility and the trust of our media organizations are being eroded. It's a dual lever to confuse and denigrate the profession of journalism, and to keep us from being able to help inform the public in a way that they can make decisions about their lives and how to move forward.
Right. And just to build off that, what do you see as the reaction that journalists have right now when they are a victim of these attacks? What is the mind frame that they're in, the state of mind that they're in, and
Yeah.
you know, like how are they coping with this kind of stuff?
It's difficult because there are significant effects. As I said, typically the kinds of things that we see against journalists, journalists that are targeted, journalists of color, women journalists, political journalists. As I said, there's a group responsible for changing narratives in the country and bringing different stories to the forefront. And whether it's the misogynists or the nationalists, their goal is to make sure that they can preserve a certain narrative of what our country's history is and who has power in it. And so they are using those dual levers, as I said, to significantly affect the public discourse and narrative around what's happening in our country and who's responsible for it.
Right. David, I just wanted to jump over to you real quick on this. What from what you've seen and what you've covered from your days in covering Washington, when you didn't have all of these social streams coming at you nonstop, to what you've seen over the past 5-10 years, what do you see out there in that space, and how do you think journalists can handle this sort of thing?
Well, I'm speaking, of course, Jim, as a conventional mainstream political writer and editor, of course. And when I began this work, journalists were just coming out of the dark ages where there were no journalism schools, or very few, and that journalists, I mean, I began working in a newsroom where at least half the journalists didn't have a college education, not one day of it, to where, we worked in a newsroom with PhDs. And so people, it's a much different profession. But I would say that even at the beginning of my career, which was about 50 years ago, journalists were deeply respected in the community. They were treated with respect, not always with affection. They weren't subjects of abuse. They were subjects of ridicule from time to time as ink-stained wretches. I would say that my parents, who were devoutly middle class, were horrified that I would go into this profession, but they were proud to see the stories in the paper. Today, we journalists, and Michelle underlined this, are under attack from everybody. No matter what you do, you've offended somebody, and they're going to call you up, or they're going to send you a vicious note. I write this column for the Globe and Mail, which is published in Canada, which is a civilized nation, a G7 nation with good manners, unlike others, and where people don't interrupt each other. And I repeatedly get vicious notes from a couple of people. And I didn't get one the other day from some guy after I wrote a piece. So I actually wrote him a note and asked him if he was okay. I mean, I usually hear from you within 20 minutes telling me how I'm, a scourge of the earth. So it's not a profession. We used to say it's not a profession to go in to make money. I would say now it's not a profession to go into to increase your self-esteem. I used to say when I was editor of the Post-Gazette, and Jim and Sally and I all worked together, I used to say when the phone rings in my office, it's not somebody calling to say I love you.
Well, I mean, if it was me, yeah.
Even from my wife.
So, Dr. Ferrier, just to expand on that, like, I know you'll get into it a lot more in your workshop, but what are just some high level things that you're telling journalists that they can do to really help themselves get through these types of incidents that they're going through?
Right. So one thing, I'm an educator, and so I really, we must bring, as the James Foley Foundation has done with their curriculum, we have to bring better and different training to our students, because we are living in a digital culture. COVID put an exclamation point on it. The protests have put an exclamation point on it, but we are living in a surveillance state, and the beginnings of repressive regime, as many journalists have experienced in other foreign countries. And we have to learn from the lessons of those journalists about how to operate and be able to tell our stories, because the war zone has come to our doorsteps, and for some of us to our beds. And this is a life or death issue. And I don't think we are providing the appropriate training and understanding of the role of journalism in shaping narratives and shaping where we move forward as a country. So two things. One, I think the journalism itself needs to reorient itself in a way that it can be much more inclusive and diverse in the stories it's telling. And that includes inside our newsrooms, which have been challenged with the diversity and bringing that diversity to our pages. But ultimately, our students and anyone else in the profession needs to be aware of this larger environment and all the ways in which we do our work, in which we are at risk. It is not just being out on the streets. It is opening your email. It is picking up the phone. It is listening to nasty voicemails that may come to you, and trying to determine what you do as a professional to be able to diminish the effects of that and have the resilience to be able to come back from that and continue to do your work.
If I could add one,
journalists, I'm sorry, I was just.
If I could add one thing to what Professor Ferrier just said. I think students need to also know that when they get a threat or a particularly vicious communication, they need to tell somebody about it. And by somebody, I don't mean their roommate. I mean the police or the FBI, certainly their supervisor. When Jim, Sally, and I worked together, we insisted upon this. Some people want to defund the police, but we want to call them from time to time when our journalists are being assaulted or in danger of such. This is not something to laugh about. It's deadly serious, and we should take threats with real seriousness. And I know Professor Ferrier feels the same way.
All right. So what we've been trying to do is help people understand that even what might seem like an innocuous threat, as I said, we're our own worst danger, because we consider it a professional badge of honor that we must be doing something right if we're getting these critiques. We must be irritating the right people to have them come at us. But the ways in which the internet has been weaponized the misogyny and the ways of gendered attacks that have come at women journalists and the racial attacks that have come at journalists of color. And the ways in which they are specifically targeted with coordinated campaigns to cancel culture and everything from there to death threats and rape threats behind the scenes. We do, as David said, need to be aware that this is happening, not shrug it off and tell someone else. Because what I find in my conversations with people is that if there is a troll that's irritating one reporter in your newsroom, they're probably doing it to someone else as well. And because you're not coordinating your information from across the newsroom by telling somebody about what's happened to you, you're missing the connections and the dots. And I say that because if we learn anything from the murders of our colleagues at the Capitol Gazette, is that the behavior of that murderer started online with lots of activity in emails, virulent emails and violent emails, and led to litigation and other things. He was not an unknown quantity to that newsroom. And it ultimately ended up in something quote unquote real, which was the materialization of his threats that he'd made. And so one, I would say, don't ignore it. Two, don't shrug it off and think it's not that important, because each of these, as I said, are data points that may have been able to point to who's perpetrating it and get them to stop. Second, I would have you look at the environment everywhere you are disclosing those things, and we look at your risk, not only your physical security, your psychosocial, and your online security. And it's an ongoing practice to continue to build your digital resilience in a surveillance state where the technologies themselves are designed to collect all the data that it can about you and spew that back out to people who may have nefarious reasons for getting that information. So specifically for students, building up separate social profiles, if indeed you are forced by your outlet to push out content on your social media, etc. Begin now and creating separate personal and professional profiles so that you separate your identity. And that may mean for some young women journalists that they change their name and or use initials or use a pseudonym of some sort, so that they can create an alias that masks their location and gives them a little bit of privacy from these kinds of attacks, because they do come offline. We just today had news of a college student who was swatted by some of her roommates, so-called roommates, friends, other students, where SWAT teams from the police were sent to her dorm room because they had told that she had a knife or something that she was wielding. That is especially dangerous for Black people, especially dangerous for people of color to have the police weaponized in that way. And so the doxing that happens where your personal information is disclosed, we try and work with you to shut down the access to you in physical space so that you can somewhat begin to operate feeling like you don't have to be hypervigilant, and allow you the space to be able to continue to do your reporting. And that includes helping you think about the ways that you're collecting your data, how you're protecting your sources from secondary harm from your stories, and access to the data, and how to protect your devices so that so you and your data and your sources can stay safe from the stories that we're telling.
Yeah, Jim, could I just ask the Dean a question? I agree with almost everything Professor Ferrier said. She's a great resource. But I do wonder about the ethics. This is where traditional ethics collide with the conditions of today, about journalists having pseudonyms for their work. I think it's different from Norma Baker calling herself, I guess was it Marilyn Monroe. What are the ethical
journalists
things?
have in the past had pseudonyms.
No, I understand that, but I think there was a period in which that was looked down upon. I'm not deploring this. I'm just inquiring.
Right. Well, it's interesting that you should ask about ethics. We've got a couple of faculty here on the call today who teach ethics. Jim, did you want to go ahead and talk about this, or did you want to go into some other topics more relevant to the panel? And David, we can get back to that
Sure.
issue, of course, and talk about that. Perhaps
I once knew a reporter. This was long ago. Who was Bill Borders when he wrote about politics, but he was Jack Denty when he wrote about the Red Sox. So.
Right.
So you're right. It's nothing new. But I wondered about the ethical. We can get back to that later.
We also need to use discernment in when we're putting our name and our byline onto a story. And so there are choices all along the workflow of what we do as journalists where we can make better choices about how and where and when we deploy our name. And David, there was a distinct switch that was hinted at earlier in the conversation, where journalism made this turn about 10, 15 years ago towards more authenticity, more transparency, better trust, etc. Yes, I'm a journalism professor, and the history is very clear. In that area, though, however, in requiring what were people who were typically behind the scenes. This is coinciding with the social media movement. So columnists were the only people that had their faces in the newspaper and their identity. And then TV journalists, obviously in front of the camera, people were able to see it. But otherwise, for the most part, everybody's identity was masked in a way that made it difficult for people to pick on them for their identity rather than from their work. What we're seeing is coordinated activity because people are more visible, they're transparent, their faces and their names and their authenticity and their engagement with their audiences is very different than it was even 15, 10 years ago.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, and so one of the key things that I heard in everything we've just been talking about was that idea of something can start online, harassment threats, and can lead to then something physical against the journalist. And
Absolutely.
I'd like to bring Diane Foley into this now here. And, the physical safety of journalists in our country right now, what are you hearing from people in this space? And when you're bringing up the different modules that you're providing to universities for the training the next generation of journalists, what kind of things are you really advising people in our own country now who maybe not, we haven't had to deal with a lot of this in certain ways over the past 10, 15 years, but now we are like other countries, and it's getting a lot more, I guess, quote unquote, real, as Dr. Ferrier put it there. So what are you hearing out there?
Well, a lot. First of all, I am not a journalist, and I came to this because of what happened to our son, Jim Foley, who became a conflict journalist, actually. He was a freelancer and was kidnapped and killed in Syria when he was doing work in Syria. So that's how I came to the whole idea of journalism. First of all, I want to say that I do feel it's become a very heroic profession. I think it requires courage. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think young journalist students are providing a vital, providing of information to citizens is the foundation of our democracy in so many ways. So it's an essential profession, but it does require courage, and not just physical, but a moral sort of courage about how you're protecting yourself, your sources, the people around you. So, and Jim aspired to that. So I think that's at the heart of a very noble profession. But the other thing we found after, why was Jim so, as a freelancer in the conflict zone, was he vulnerable? And I think that's how our curriculum started, is we started to look around and recognized that many of the curriculums in very, very good schools of journalism didn't really stress the importance of safety like Dr. Ferrier is, because it really is a required skill set as far as I'm concerned. And I think early on, when more of our graduate curriculum is more geared towards the conflict zone. But then a few years ago, as things were changing within our own country, and I was traveling to various schools, I was starting to see that many undergraduate and graduate students were going into high-risk neighborhoods, going to cover protests and various risky situations. So it became very obvious that we needed to have smaller modules that could relate to everyday journalism here very much within our country. So that's what our undergraduate modules are. They're very short, succinct, and created so that professors can take whatever they want and put them into the curriculum, because we become very passionate about the fact that young journalists must know how to do in-depth risk assessment whenever they approach any kind of a story. You know, they need to know what the risks are, whether it's online or physical or other types of risks. So that this is something we are very passionate about, and I really certainly love to hear what Dr. Ferrier is saying, because I think it's so relevant today that it's really unconscionable of us to educate these students to do wonderful things and go out in the world and then not teach them how to protect themselves, because then they can't do the work. So thank you.
Right. Yeah, no, that's important points there. And I'd also like to bring in Sally Stapleton now. Sally, some of the things that you had to deal with during your time with me at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, covering things like the Tree of Life shooting, covering the Antoine Rose Jr. Or the second case, and trying to make sure that the people from our newsroom were safe when they went out to cover these stories, and then also make sure that our newsroom itself was safe from the outside world at times. What kind of things did you learn about that? Especially first, just going out on stories and the protest coverage that maybe in particular with that of like buddy systems or anything, any kind of protective gear, that kind of thing that we may not have thought about just even a few years ago.
So first of all, it was the three of us kind of all working together on this, but Diane's totally on the money when she says this is an acquired skill set. You've named some people in your earlier slides. John Moore has decades of experience in innumerable countries throughout the US, and over time you build up knowledge, and it helps you, it helps other people around you. It is what's required. What is, as everyone's listening, it's a little daunting, I'm sure, if you're just starting out. Just know, and then I'll go into some of the things we thought about and some of the things we did, but there are so many incredibly brilliant and free resources that you can take advantage of even at this stage. And I quickly go through those. But we started out with the Capitol Gazette murders. That was a clarion call to every news organization in the country that we needed to look at our own operation. Did we have our house in order? And of course we didn't. My sense is nobody always has their house in order. It is a continuous thing that it's not a one and done. Sorry, I've got some hallway noise here. So we called in, believe it or not, in this age, we called in the Department of Homeland Security, who had a regional director. And I think it was the combination of his background, his resources, but it was also who it was. He spent time in our newsroom. We brought everyone in. It was a guild and management learning session. We walked around the newsroom and found places that we thought were secure because you needed a badge, but when he tested them, he could just walk in and we all were shocked. That was really amazing stuff. It was free. It was his time, it was his knowledge, and he found holes in our system. And we just kind of built on that. You know, things like, do your bathrooms lock from the other side? All these tiny things that you never think of, he brought into play here. And it emboldened the staff to feel like, A, the company cares about us, and B, we're all in this together, and it was a collaborative process. As we went along, we were adding to it. We added monitors that showed our entrances. Our monitors previously were showing our metrics. Thanks to Jim, we had monitors in the newsroom. It was showing the live metrics that are very important in a digital operation. But we turned one of those, a couple of those around the newsroom, into monitors showing our entrances. I mean, these are little things that aren't cost prohibitive, but they make a big difference. 2 months after that, we had the fatal stabbing. It was a individual who had known white supremacy beliefs, who stabbed a Black man outside. The Pittsburgh Post-Gazette is in a great place, but in a bad place. It's right in between the Pirates and the Steelers, both stadiums, and it's a social gathering area. So we needed to, it was thing after thing after thing that made us know we need to protect our staff. But it wasn't just physically we needed to do it. After Tree of Life, it was emotionally and mentally. And everyone in this room who's been in a news organization knows the thing that all HR people say is we have EAP. There's an EAP hotline. And I would argue an EAP hotline is not enough. So with a very good relationship with our human resources person, we got a psychologist into our newsroom who the staff had access to. Did it solve all the issues? No, but it's the beginning of the step, and there are innumerable steps in this in the entire process.
That's great, Sally. And the emotional toll that it takes on journalists of covering a lot of these events. I know personally I've, with Post-Gazette and then also with NBC before that, covering a number of national stories, everyone kind of builds up and builds up and builds up. And there's a certain point where it's, some journalists just can't take any more of that and really need help and need supportive newsrooms, especially managers and everything like that. David, what did you kind of see within our newsroom after the Tree of Life shooting, and how did you kind of help the newsroom from an emotional standpoint?
Well, before I became executive editor of the Post-Gazette, I had been the Washington bureau chief for the Boston Globe, and that was during the 9/11 episode. And we had journalists in our bureau who were quite shaken by that and who had survivor guilt. Why did I survive when these other people died? And so I grew accustomed or knew how to deal with this, and to know that news executives were trained to know how to write a story or lay out a page were uniquely unsuited to counsel people in grief or people who wrapped in fear. And though I did the best I could on those things, and I did call, and after 9/11, after Tree of Life, several of our, who I thought were our most vulnerable journalists, some of whom lived within blocks, as I did, of Tree of Life, to reassure them and to offer them comfort. It was imperative that we had professionals involved as well. It's also imperative, I have to add one more thing, that from the very top of a news organization, it is imperative that the editor and her executives beneath her or him make it clear that no story is worth the death of a journalist. Now that may be a tautology, but it needs to be said. Journalists like to get the story. Journalists like to be on the scene. They don't necessarily like risk, but they're not averse to it. And we have to be careful to calibrate those risks and to be very, very careful and to make it clear that no one's job depends upon jeopardizing her life or his life.
Jim, I'd just add to that, one of the things that we do with TrollBusters beyond kind of monitoring the environment is really providing that hands-on coaching with journalists of all types, and including really that mental health element, because this is a difficult time for many people, but particularly challenging in that we have to navigate both public and digital spaces to be able to do this work. And many of us have to be in those digital spaces. And so there's not the option, as the police might tell you, to just get off social media. So I think it's important, as David said, to make sure that you are attending to your mental health and to your resilience, and building into your journalism work the distance, the practices, etc., the visual practices of minimizing the visuals so that you're not seeing the violence full screen, things like that you can help in your daily workflow to help minimize the damage, really, from being exposed to all of that content on a regular basis.
Yeah.
Right. I do want to just mention, if anyone does have questions for any of our panelists, feel free to put it in the chat. Now would be a great time, and we'll open it up to questions as well. But I'd like to bring it back to Sally. Let's talk a little bit about like going out in the field to cover stories, especially big ones. I know personally, being at NBC, it was always, when you're sending out a reporter to a story, it's usually a reporter and photographer together, but they're going out to cover things that are, like breaking news, and you don't know what you're going to get into when you get there. And I had Shamari Stone from NBC Washington. He's a breaking news reporter. He came to my class a couple of weeks ago and was talking about the buddy system with him and his photographer, making sure they know where each other is at all times, being within reach of each other. When one's shooting video, the other one's kind of monitoring, looking around to make sure that it's a safe scene, that kind of thing. What kind of stuff did you try to impart upon the reporters and photographers, not only at the Post-Gazette, but even through your time at the AP, of how to keep themselves safe out in the field?
So, let's do a more recent example. So the racial injustice protests in New York City got a little bit out of hand, not less because of those that were on the street, but because of the way the cops cleared things out. And so we very definitely had photographers and videographers working together. I really believe in a lot of these situations working with people who are visual people, who the essence of their job is being there. They're the ones who started wearing bicycle helmets 2 decades ago, because they understood that was necessary for them to be in a rock throwing situation and not have, and try and elude a serious accident. So that's a basic. But there is a certain point, we haven't talked about it, but in this profession, people were saying you during the pandemic, you can't get at these stories. Well, look at what the AP did. We did it. We did it with people who figured out the ways to do it around the world, and they didn't stay on a situation maybe as long, but they did it. That's our jobs. But you have to understand who feels comfortable doing that and who's doing that because they're fearful that if they say no, they're never going to get another good assignment. So it's a really tough thing, figuring out who really wants to go, who's going because they think there's some kind of guilt by saying, I don't feel comfortable in this situation, it's tough. And then there's a certain point where you just tell people, just pull out. As David said, it's not worth staying through the night and potentially facing something that you really don't want to have to deal with.
Anyone else want to chime in on this?
I think Sally hit on something that we haven't really talked about, and as I said, the unwillingness of journalists to talk about and disclose this type of thing. There's the challenge that we have not wanted to be the story and talk about the ways in which we have been attacked online, offline, etc. You see a little bit more of that in terms of the pushback from individual journalists online. If they're attacked, they may go back on the counter attack and put out that they're under attack. But that's a fairly new manifestation. But one of the real challenges is the fear of retaliation from journalists themselves who fear going to management, or to, if they're freelancer, going to the outfit that has assigned them the story and telling them about problems, because then they become toxic and literally their financial stream dries up. So there are different strategies, and as a freelancer, you must think differently, because your reputation and your online reputation is everything, and how you get your work moving forward. And outfits, media organizations are going to be loath to reach out and touch someone who has been a part of and a target of a media storm like this.
And Diane, I thought you were going to chime in there for a second. Did you? Oh, you're on mute. You're on mute.
No, I just wanted, I heard somebody ask about free resources, and there are a lot, and that is what we have tried to do in the James Foley safety curricula, is bring together a lot of the resources from the Committee to Protect Journalists, Reporters Without Borders, and others. These were done in a collaborative way by a lot of the members of the Alliance for a Culture of Safety. So after the deaths of many journalists in 2014, that is when we fully recognized the vulnerability of particularly freelance journalists in conflict zones. And that is when a lot of NGOs stepped up and started sharing these resources. So that's partly what we've tried to do, Jim, in the curriculum. And it is totally free for any professors to use, or schools of journalism. Several schools recently, Marquette University, their undergraduate program fully integrated the undergraduate curricula into their standing curriculum, and it worked very well. We had excellent feedback and critique, because it's ever changing and certainly needs to be adapted and improved. And I would welcome any of you to find ways to use this and critique it or add to or whatever. We feel passionate about the need that it needs to be out there.
And Jim, I just wanted to mention, thank you, Michelle. You listed a website for digital hygiene lessons on here. And Sally, I know you had mentioned there are free resources as well that newsrooms might access to help them and their reporters be safer. And so perhaps if you could share some of those with us afterward, we can capture some of these links and lists of resources and send it out to the attendees tonight after the webinar is over.
Great. And also, if anybody hasn't registered for any of the workshops afterwards, Tom Durkin, Diane, your partner there at the James Foley Foundation, he's going to be presenting, I think, at least one of the modules there tonight as well, so you can get a kind of a preview of what that is from him there. So with that, we only have a few minutes left. Anyone have any final words that they'd like to share with our group here?
Well, I'd like to say that as Professor Ferrier say, the work has never been more dangerous, but I would add the corollary that the work has never been more important. And that every single panel head is shaking, is nodding in agreement. Never been more important,
Absolutely.
never been more vital, and I have to say, never been more appreciated by the public, even though it sometimes doesn't feel that way. And so I would sign off by saying, have courage, have heart, and have faith and have belief, because we need to believe in what we do, and what we do is never been more important.
Hear, hear.
Great. Thank you, David. Thank you. And thank you all on our panel for joining us tonight. We will have the workshops. There's a separate Zoom link. So if you, if hopefully you have that, it's a separate one. So we're going to close this Zoom and we'll have another one. So just be aware of that. And also would love to thank everyone who came in attendance tonight, and also thank the Ogden Newspaper's seminar series for their support in this venture. So thank you, everyone. Appreciate it, and hope we all learned a few things here tonight about staying safe. So thank you all,